Standing in the law office 48 hours after burying the only father figure I'd ever known, I watched my brother Marcus transform from grieving grandson to something I didn't recognize. The lawyer's words hung in the air like smoke. $87 million. Marcus's eyes went wide, then narrow, calculating. He turned to me with that same cold expression he'd worn at the funeral when he told me real men don't cry. But now I understood. He hadn't been grieving at all. He'd been waiting. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning of Grandpa Theodore's funeral, I woke up in his guest bedroom for what I knew would be the last time. Chelsea Morrison, that's me, 26 years old and suddenly feeling like an orphan all over again. The house on Maple Ridge Drive in Burlington, Vermont had been my sanctuary since I was 12, when Mom died and Dad decided parenting was too complicated for his new lifestyle in California. Grandpa Theo raised Marcus and me like we were his own kids, not his burden. He taught us how to tie our shoes, helped with homework, attended every school play and soccer game. He was the steady presence that held our fractured family together with his quiet strength and endless patience. Marcus had driven up from Boston the night before, my older brother by 3 years, always impeccably dressed, always composed. He worked in finance, wore expensive suits, and had opinions about everything. As I came downstairs that morning, I found him in the kitchen, already dressed in his funeral attire, scrolling through his phone while drinking coffee from Grandpa's favorite mug. "Morning," I mumbled, still in my pajamas, eyes puffy from crying myself to sleep. Marcus barely looked up. "The service starts at 11. You should probably get ready soon." I stared at him. Our grandfather had died 3 days ago after a brief battle with pneumonia, and Marcus was treating it like a business appointment. No red eyes, no signs he'd lost any sleep. Just that same controlled demeanor he'd perfected over the years. "Did you sleep at all?" I asked, pouring myself coffee with shaking hands. "Sleep doesn't bring him back," Marcus replied, finally looking at me with something between annoyance and disappointment. "And neither does falling apart. You might want to pull yourself together before we get there. People will be watching." The funeral home was packed. Grandpa Theo had touched so many lives during his 83 years. Former students from his high school teaching days, neighbors, members of his chess club, veterans from his army unit. Everyone had a story about his kindness, his wisdom, his terrible jokes that somehow always made you smile. I sat in the front row, tissues clutched in my lap, trying to hold back the waves of grief that kept crashing over me. Mrs. Henderson from next door squeezed my shoulder and whispered how sorry she was. Tom Bradley from the hardware store told me how Grandpa always brightened his day when he came in for his weekly visit. Each condolence felt like another reminder that the most important person in my world was gone. Marcus sat beside me, straight-backed and stoic, acknowledging mourners with polite nods but showing no emotion. When Pastor Williams asked if anyone wanted to share memories, several people spoke about Grandpa's generosity, his volunteer work at the food bank, how he'd helped them through difficult times. I wanted to speak, but every time I tried to stand, tears would start flowing and I'd sink back into my seat. Finally, Marcus rose and walked to the podium. He spoke clearly and eloquently about Theodore Morrison's legacy, his dedication to family, his principles, and integrity. It was a beautiful tribute, and it felt completely hollow. Marcus delivered it like a presentation, hitting all the right points without any genuine feeling behind the words. After the service, as we walked to the cemetery, Marcus finally acknowledged my tears. "Chelsea, you need to get control of yourself," he said quietly but firmly. "Real men don't cry, and neither should real women. Grandpa wouldn't want to see you like this. He'd want you to be strong." I stopped walking. "Real men don't cry? Are you serious right now?" "I'm serious about honoring his memory properly," Marcus replied. "He was a strong man who faced everything with dignity. The least we can do is show the same strength." At the graveside, I watched through blurred vision as they lowered the casket. My legs felt weak, my chest tight with the weight of saying goodbye. Marcus stood like a statue, not a single tear on his cheek, not even when they threw the first handful of dirt onto the polished wood.
The reception at the church was a blur of casseroles, sympathy cards, and more stories about Grandpa's impact on the community. Marcus worked the room like a politician, shaking hands, making small talk, playing the part of the composed, grateful grandson. I found myself hiding in the bathroom twice, overwhelmed by the finality of it all. During the drive back to the house that evening, Marcus was already talking about practical matters, cleaning up the property, handling estate details, getting everything sorted quickly and efficiently. I stared out the window at the familiar streets, knowing this was probably my last time seeing them. "The lawyer wants to see us Thursday morning," Marcus said as we pulled into the driveway. "Something about the will, probably just formalities, but we should get it done." That night, I lay in Grandpa's guest bed, surrounded by the faint smell of his cologne and Old Spice soap that still lingered in the linens. The house felt enormous and empty without his presence. No sound of the evening news from his recliner, no gentle snoring from his bedroom down the hall. Just silence and the overwhelming reality that I was truly alone now.
Marcus had taken Grandpa's bedroom without asking, claiming he needed the space for work calls. I heard him on the phone well past midnight, discussing some business deal in his usual clipped professional tone. Even here, even now, he couldn't set aside his ambitions long enough to properly grieve. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. The law office of Fitzgerald and Associates was located in downtown Burlington, in one of those bold brick buildings that had been converted to professional offices. Marcus wore his most expensive suit, navy blue with a subtle pinstripe, while I'd chosen a simple black dress that Grandpa had once complimented. James Fitzgerald was a tall, thin man in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been Grandpa's attorney for over 20 years and had handled the legal details when Mom died. He greeted us both warmly, offering condolences and sharing his own memories of Theodore Morrison. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man," he said as we settled into the leather chairs across from his desk. "Honest, principled, and deeply devoted to both of you. He spoke about you constantly. Chelsea's teaching career, Marcus's success in finance. You were his greatest pride." Marcus shifted impatiently. "We appreciate that, Mr. Fitzgerald. About the will?" "Of course." The lawyer opened a thick file folder. "Theodore was very specific about his wishes. He wanted me to read the will to you both personally, rather than just sending copies." He cleared his throat and began reading the formal language about Theodore Morrison being of sound mind and body. Standard beneficiaries, for small items, his watch to Tom Bradley, some books to the library, $5,000 to his church. Then, Fitzgerald's voice took on a different tone. "To my beloved grandchildren, Marcus and Chelsea Morrison, who have been the light of my life since they came to live with me, I leave the remainder of my estate to be divided equally between them." I expected the house, maybe some savings. Grandpa had lived simply, drove an old Toyota, shopped at discount stores. He'd been comfortable, but never seemed wealthy. Fitzgerald continued reading, and I felt the world tilt slightly. Stock portfolios, real estate investments, municipal bonds, a collection of rare coins that had been appraised at $2 million alone. Property in 3 different states, business partnerships I'd never heard of. The final number hit like a physical blow, $87 million. The silence in the office was deafening. Marcus sat frozen, his composed mask finally cracking as his mouth fell open. I felt like I couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I'd just heard. "87 million?" I whispered. Fitzgerald nodded solemnly. "Your grandfather was an extremely shrewd investor. He started with his teacher's pension and military benefits, lived well below his means, and invested wisely for over 40 years. He never touched the principal, just reinvested the returns. He wanted to ensure you both would never face the financial struggles your mother experienced." Marcus found his voice first, but it came out strangled. He never said anything. He lived like he had nothing. "That was intentional," the lawyer explained. "Theodore believed money could corrupt young people if they knew about it too early. He wanted you both to develop your own work ethic and values before inheriting wealth. He was very proud that you both succeeded on your own merits." I was still staring at the papers, trying to make sense of the numbers. $43.5 million. Each.
More money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. And Marcus, who had lectured me about strength and dignity, who had shown no emotion at the funeral, who had criticized my tears, was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Calculation. Pure, cold calculation. The drive back to Grandpa's house passed in complete silence. Marcus gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white, while I stared out the passenger window, watching Burlington's familiar streets blur past. The weight of what we'd just learned sat between us like a third passenger. $43.5 million each. Numbers that didn't feel real, attached to a man who darned his own socks and clipped grocery store coupons. Marcus pulled into the driveway and killed the engine, but neither of us moved to get out. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the front yard, where Grandpa had taught me to ride a bike, where we'd raked leaves every fall, where he'd sat on the porch swing reading his newspaper every evening after dinner. "We need to talk," Marcus finally said, his voice different somehow, sharper, more focused than I'd heard it since arriving for the funeral. Inside the house, Marcus immediately went to Grandpa's desk in the living room and started pulling out drawers, rifling through papers with an urgency that made my stomach turn. Bank statements, investment documents, insurance policies, everything scattered across the antique mahogany surface that Grandpa had kept meticulously organized. "What are you doing?" I asked, still standing in the doorway.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Research, Marcus replied without looking up. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with here. Fitzgerald mentioned properties in 3 states. I want to know what they are, what they're worth, what kind of maintenance they require. He found a manila folder labeled Real Estate Holdings and spread the contents across the coffee table. Deeds to a lakefront cabin in New Hampshire, a small apartment building in Portland, Maine, and a commercial property in downtown Boston that housed 3 retail stores. Each property had recent appraisal documents attached. The Boston property alone is worth $12 million, Marcus said, scanning the paperwork. The rental income from the apartment building is $30,000 a month. Jesus, Chelsea, he was basically running a real estate empire while we thought he was just a retired teacher living on Social Security. I picked up a photograph that had fallen from one of the folders. Grandpa, as a young man in his army uniform, standing next to a jeep with 3 other soldiers. On the back, someone had written, Korea, 1953, T. Morrison and the Boys. He looked so young, so serious, with no idea that 60 years later, he'd be leaving his grandchildren a fortune. He must have started investing right after the war, I said softly, probably saved every penny from his teaching salary. Marcus was already 3 folders deep into what appeared to be decades of financial records. Look at this. He bought Apple stock in 1982, Microsoft in 1986, Amazon in 1997. He was buying tech companies before most people even knew what the internet was, and he never sold, just kept buying and holding. The methodical way Marcus was cataloging everything made me increasingly uncomfortable. He'd transformed from my grieving brother into something that resembled his work persona, cold, analytical, focused entirely on numbers and potential returns. He hadn't mentioned Grandpa once since leaving the lawyer's office, only the money. "Marcus, can we slow down for a second?" I said. 3 hours ago, we were burying our grandfather. Now you're going through his papers like you're auditing a company? He looked up at me with irritation. 3 hours ago, we thought we were inheriting a house and maybe some savings. Now we know we're dealing with nearly $90 million. That changes everything, Chelsea. We have responsibilities now. Responsibilities? Legal obligations, tax implications, estate management. Marcus pulled out another folder. Do you have any idea what the capital gains are going to be on some of these investments? What it's going to cost to maintain 3 properties in different states? The insurance alone is probably $50,000 a year. I sat down heavily in Grandpa's recliner, the worn leather still holding the impression of his body. The chair smelled like his aftershave and the peppermint candies he always kept in his pocket. He's been gone for 4 days, Marcus. 4 days. And you're already talking about taxes and insurance?
Because someone has to, Marcus snapped. Someone has to be practical here. You want to sit around crying about it? That's fine, but this money isn't going to manage itself. Something cold settled in my chest. Is that what you think I'm doing? Crying about inheriting millions of dollars? Marcus didn't answer, but his expression said everything. He thought I was being weak, emotional, impractical, the same way he'd looked at me at the funeral when I couldn't stop the tears. I found myself studying my brother as he continued sorting through documents. When had he become this person? Growing up, Marcus had been protective of me, patient when I struggled with math homework, proud when I got into college. He'd helped me move into my first apartment, co-signed my car loan when my credit wasn't established. But somewhere along the way, success had hardened him. The finance world had taught him to see everything in terms of profit and loss. Remember when we were kids, I said, and Grandpa used to take us to that diner on Sunday mornings? He'd order the same thing every time. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, coffee black. And he'd always let us get chocolate chip pancakes, even though they cost extra. Marcus glanced up briefly. What's your point? He never acted like money mattered. Not once in 15 years did he ever make us feel like we were a burden or like he couldn't afford something we needed. He drove that same Toyota for 12 years, but he never hesitated to pay for your college application fees or my art supplies. That's because he had $90 million, Marcus said dismissively. Easy to be generous when you're secretly wealthy. No, Marcus, he was generous because that's who he was. The money didn't make him kind. He was kind despite having money. Marcus finally stopped shuffling papers and looked at me directly. What exactly are you trying to say? I'm saying you've changed since we walked out of that law office. You've changed, and I don't like what I'm seeing. His jaw tightened. I'm being responsible. One of us has to think about the practical aspects of this situation.
Responsible? You've been going through his personal papers for 2 hours like you're conducting a hostile takeover. You haven't said his name once since we got home. It's like he stopped being our grandfather the moment you heard that number. Marcus stood up abruptly, sending several documents fluttering to the floor. Don't lecture me about grief, Chelsea. I loved him too. But I'm not going to dishonor his memory by being careless with what he worked his entire life to build. And I'm not going to dishonor his memory by turning into someone he wouldn't recognize. The words hung in the air between us, sharp and accusatory. Marcus's face flushed red, and for a moment I thought he might yell. Instead, he bent down and carefully gathered the scattered papers, his movements precise and controlled. Fine, he said quietly. We'll do this your way. We'll sit around being sad and nostalgic while lawyers and tax officials and estate planners circle like vultures. We'll let sentiment cloud our judgment and make decisions based on feelings instead of facts. That's not what I'm saying, and you know it. Marcus straightened up, holding the papers against his chest like armor. What I know is that Grandpa trusted us with something enormous, something that took him 40 years to build. And whether you want to admit it or not, we're not the same people who walked into that law office this morning. We can't be. $90 million changes everything, whether we like it or not. He was right about one thing. We weren't the same people anymore. But the change in Marcus felt deeper than just the shock of inheritance. It felt permanent, fundamental, like some essential part of my brother had been replaced by a stranger who calculated before he felt, who saw assets instead of memories. I'm going to take a shower, Marcus announced, gathering his folders. Then I'm going to start making phone calls. We need to schedule meetings with estate planners, tax attorneys, and investment advisors. The sooner we get professionals involved, the better. After he disappeared upstairs, I remained in Grandpa's chair, surrounded by the remnants of a lifetime I was only now beginning to understand. Hidden behind the simple exterior of a retired teacher was a financial mastermind who'd quietly built an empire while never losing sight of what truly mattered: family, kindness, integrity. I picked up the army photograph again, studying Grandpa's young face. He'd survived a war, lost his wife, raised 2 abandoned grandchildren, and somehow managed to accumulate enough wealth to set us up for life, all while maintaining his fundamental decency. Now that he is gone, would we be able to do the same? Upstairs, I could hear Marcus on the phone, his voice carrying down the stairs in clipped, professional tones. He was already making appointments, already moving forward with his systematic approach to handling our inheritance. Part of me knew he was right about the practical necessities, but another part, the part that still felt Grandpa's presence in every corner of this house, worried that in our rush to manage his legacy, we might lose the very qualities that had made him worth remembering. The late afternoon sun was slanting through the living room windows, casting the same golden light that had illuminated thousands of quiet evenings when Grandpa would sit in this exact spot reading his newspaper, completely unaware that his grandchildren saw him as anything other than the most important person in their world. Now I wondered what else we'd never known about the man who'd raised us. And more importantly, I wondered if the money he'd left us would bring out the best in who we could become, or reveal the worst of who we already were. I woke up Friday morning to the sound of strangers' voices drifting up from the kitchen. Marcus had apparently started his day at dawn, because by the time I made it downstairs at 7:30, 3 people in expensive suits were already seated around Grandpa's breakfast table, laptops open, documents spread everywhere. "Chelsea, perfect timing," Marcus said without looking up from a thick binder. "I want you to meet our new team. This is Patricia Walsh from Hartwell Estate Planning, David Chen from Morrison & Associates Tax Law, and Jennifer Brooks from Elite Investment Management." The 3 professionals smiled politely and offered their condolences, but I could tell they were eager to get back to business. Patricia, a sharp-featured woman in her 40s, was already pulling up spreadsheets on her laptop. David, younger and wearing wire-rimmed glasses, had a legal pad covered in calculations. Jennifer looked like she belonged on the cover of Forbes, perfectly styled blonde hair, designer blazer, the kind of confidence that came from managing other people's millions. "We've been reviewing your grandpa's portfolio since 5 a.m., Jennifer said, her voice crisp and professional. "I have to say, he was an extraordinary investor. His long-term strategy was absolutely brilliant." Marcus beamed like he'd personally been complimented. "We're looking at optimization strategies, tax mitigation, portfolio rebalancing. There's a lot of work to be done." I poured myself coffee and sat in the one remaining chair, feeling like an intruder in my own grandpa's kitchen. These people were dissecting his life's work like it was just another client file, reducing 40 years of careful planning to charts and projections. "The immediate priority," Patricia explained, looking at both of us, "is establishing individual trusts to minimize estate taxes. We're also recommending the creation of a family limited partnership for the real estate holdings." "Family limited partnership?" I asked. David adjusted his glasses and launched into what sounded like a rehearsed explanation. "It's a legal entity that allows you to transfer assets while retaining control and reducing gift and estate tax exposure. Given the size of your inheritance, we could potentially save millions in taxes." Marcus was nodding along like he understood every word, but I caught him glancing at his phone to Google family limited partnership when he thought no one was looking. The Marcus I grew up with would have admitted he needed clarification. This new version was too proud to show any weakness in front of his hired experts. "What about the properties?" Marcus asked. "The apartment building in Portland is generating $30,000 a month, but David thinks we might be better served by selling and reinvesting in a REIT." "Real Estate Investment Trust," Jennifer clarified for my benefit, though her tone suggested she assumed I wouldn't understand anyway. "More liquid, less hands-on management required, potentially higher returns." I set down my coffee cup harder than necessary. "You want to sell Grandpa's properties?" "We want to optimize the portfolio," Marcus corrected. "Grandpa was brilliant, but he wasn't a professional money manager. Some of his holdings are outdated. That cabin in New Hampshire, for instance, it's been sitting empty for 3 years. We could sell it and put that capital to work in growth investments." The cabin in New Hampshire, where Grandpa had taken us every summer for 2 weeks, teaching us to fish and skip stones and identify different types of trees, where he'd sit on the dock every evening, watching the sunset reflect off the lake, completely at peace, where he'd told us stories about Mom as a little girl, keeping her memory alive when everyone else seemed to want to forget. "He loved that cabin," I said quietly.
Patricia looked uncomfortable, probably sensing the family tension. Of course, these are just recommendations. Ultimately, the decisions are yours to make. Jointly, Marcus added, shooting me a look, we own everything 50-50, which means we need to agree on major decisions. The implication was clear. Marcus had already made up his mind about what needed to be done, and he expected me to fall in line with his expert-approved plan. The three professionals continued their presentation, throwing around terms like diversification strategy and alternative investments and hedge fund opportunities. Marcus asked informed-sounding questions that I suspected he'd researched online that morning. I found myself studying Jennifer Brooks while she explained why we should move money from Grandpa's conservative bond portfolio into more aggressive growth stocks. She was probably my age, maybe a year or two older, but she carried herself with the kind of authority that came from managing hundreds of millions of dollars. Her manicured nails clicked against her laptop keys as she pulled up projected returns, showing us how much more money we could make if we just trusted her expertise. Based on current market conditions and your risk tolerance, Jennifer was saying, I'd recommend moving 60% of your liquid assets into our premier growth portfolio. We're looking at potential annual returns of 12 to 15% compared to the 4% you're currently seeing in Treasury bonds. What's the downside? I asked, surprising myself by speaking up. Jennifer paused, clearly not expecting questions from what she probably saw as the emotional, impractical sister. All investments carry risk, naturally, but our portfolio is diversified across multiple sectors and international markets. We've had only one negative year in the past decade. What about 2008? I pressed. What did your clients do during the financial crisis? Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Chelsea, that was 15 years ago. The market has completely recovered. Some clients experienced temporary setdowns, Jennifer admitted carefully, but anyone who stayed the course more than recovered their losses. The key is having a long-term perspective. Temporary setdowns. I wondered how many of her clients had lost their homes, their retirement savings, their children's college funds during those temporary setdowns. Grandpa had lived through the Great Depression as a child, witnessed multiple economic crashes as an adult. His conservative approach wasn't ignorance, it was wisdom earned through experience. After 2 hours of presentations and projections, the three experts packed up their materials and promised to have detailed recommendations ready by Monday. Marcus walked them to their cars, shaking hands and thanking them for coming on such short notice. I watched from the kitchen window as he stood in the driveway, checking his phone while their expensive sedans pulled away. Well, that was productive, Marcus said when he came back inside. Patricia thinks we can set up the trusts within 2 weeks. David's already started the paperwork for changing the property titles. And Jennifer's portfolio recommendations could increase our annual income by $2 million. $2 million. The number didn't even register as real anymore. We'd crossed some threshold where money had stopped being about security or comfort and become purely abstract, points in a game, numbers on a screen.
Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. He looked up from his phone, where he was apparently reading emails from his new advisory team. Sure. When you think about this inheritance, what do you see? What do you mean? I mean, when you picture what this money represents, what comes to mind? Grandpa's 40 years of careful saving? His hope that we'd be secure? Or do you just see opportunity? Marcus set down his phone and looked at me like I was asking him to solve a complex equation. I see responsibility, he said finally. I see the chance to honor what he built by making it grow even more. He trusted us with this, Chelsea. The least we can do is manage it intelligently. And selling his properties, moving his money into high-risk investments, that's honoring what he built? It's honoring his intelligence, Marcus replied, his voice getting that sharp edge again. He wasn't sentimental about money, and neither should we be. He bought that cabin as an investment in 1987. The fact that we have good memories there doesn't change its current market value or potential returns. I felt something crack inside my chest.
You really believe that? You think he bought a lakefront cabin in New Hampshire as a financial investment? I think he was smarter than both of us about money, and he would expect us to make smart decisions with what he left us. But as I looked around the kitchen where Grandpa had made us pancakes every Saturday morning, where he'd helped us with science fair projects and listened to our teenage problems, I realized Marcus and I were remembering completely different versions of the same man. Marcus saw a brilliant investor who'd hidden his wealth behind a humble exterior. I saw a loving grandfather who'd managed to build financial security without ever letting money define who he was. The question was, which version of Theodore Morrison would we choose to honor? And more importantly, which version of ourselves would we become in the process? Marcus was already back on his phone, probably scheduling more meetings with more experts who would help us optimize and diversify and maximize our inherited fortune. Meanwhile, I sat in Grandpa's kitchen, surrounded by the simple wooden furniture he'd refinished himself, drinking coffee from the same mug he'd used every morning for 20 years, and wondering if we'd already lost something far more valuable than money: the ability to see wealth as anything other than an opportunity to get wealthier. Outside, the maple tree in the backyard was just beginning to show its fall colors, the same tree where Grandpa had hung a tire swing for us when we were kids. In a few weeks, someone else might be living here, making different memories, while Marcus and I counted our millions and congratulated ourselves on making smart financial decisions. The thought made me sick to the stomach. By Saturday evening, our grandfather's house had been transformed into something I barely recognized. Marcus had claimed the dining room as his temporary office, complete with a rented conference table, multiple monitors, and a whiteboard covered in financial projections. His laptop never stopped pinging with emails from lawyers, accountants, and investment advisors. The quiet sanctuary where Grandpa used to work on crossword puzzles and read his mystery novels had become the headquarters of what Marcus kept calling Morrison Family Enterprises. I escaped to the front porch with a cup of tea, needing air and silence. The October evening was crisp, with the kind of golden light that made everything look like a postcard. Mrs. Henderson was watering her flower boxes next door, and she waved when she saw me. "How are you holding up, sweetheart?" she called over the fence. "Taking it one day at a time," I replied, which felt like the understatement of the century. She set down her watering can and walked closer to the fence. Dorothy Henderson was 74, had lived next door for 30 years, and had been one of Grandpa's closest friends. She'd brought us casseroles when we first moved in as kids, helped with grocery runs when Grandpa's arthritis flared up, and spent countless evenings on this very porch discussing everything from politics to gardening. "I keep expecting to see him out here with his evening paper," she said softly. "Yesterday, I made an extra pot of coffee out of habit, thinking I'd bring him a cup." "He loved those coffee visits," I said, remembering how Mrs. Henderson would appear every Tuesday and Friday morning with 2 steaming mugs and the latest neighborhood gossip. 40 years I knew that man," she continued, "and he never once mentioned being wealthy, not once. When my furnace died 3 winters ago, he insisted on paying for the repairs, said it was just neighborly kindness. If I'd known he had all that money—" Her voice trailed off, but I understood. Mrs. Henderson felt guilty for accepting help from someone she now knew was secretly a millionaire. But that was exactly the point. Grandpa's generosity had never been about showing off his wealth. It had been about caring for people, period. "He helped because he wanted to help," I told her. "The money didn't change who he was." Mrs. Henderson nodded, but she looked troubled. "That young man in the suit came by earlier asking questions about the property values on the street. Said he was thinking about development opportunities. I told him Theodore would roll over in his grave if this neighborhood got torn down for condos." My stomach dropped. Marcus was asking about property development? Well, not Marcus himself. Some fellow in an expensive car with Massachusetts plates said Marcus had hired him to do market research. I excused myself and went back inside, my hands shaking with anger.
In the dining room, Marcus was on a video call with what appeared to be another team of consultants. I waited by the doorway until he finished, then confronted him immediately. Did you hire someone to research developing this neighborhood? Marcus looked up from his laptop, not even bothering to deny it. I hired a real estate development firm to assess potential opportunities, yes. The lot sizes on this street are perfect for townhouse developments. We could potentially triple our money. Triple our money by destroying Grandpa's neighborhood? By maximizing the value of our assets, Marcus corrected. This house sits on nearly an acre of prime real estate 15 minutes from downtown Burlington. It's incredibly underutilized. I stared at him, wondering who this person was wearing my brother's face. Underutilized? Marcus, this is where we grew up. This is where Grandpa lived for 40 years. Mrs. Henderson has been his neighbor for 30 years, and you want to bulldoze her house for townhomes? I want to make smart business decisions with our inheritance, Marcus replied calmly. Sentiment doesn't pay tax bills or generate returns. If we're going to be responsible stewards of this money, we need to think like investors, not like children clinging to memories. The word stewards hit me like a slap. That's exactly what we were supposed to be, stewards of Grandpa's legacy. But Marcus had twisted the concept into something Grandpa would have found repugnant. When did you become so cold? I asked. Marcus closed his laptop and looked at me with something approaching pity. When I realized that being emotional about money is a luxury we can no longer afford. Chelsea, we're not just inheriting millions, we're inheriting responsibility for those millions. Every decision we make affects our future, our potential children's futures, their children's futures. This money could fund scholarships, support charities, and create jobs, but only if we manage it intelligently. He was using all the right words: responsibility, legacy, future generations, but his actions told a different story. In 3 days, he'd assembled a team of expensive consultants, scheduled meetings with high-risk investment firms, and apparently started exploring ways to tear down our grandfather's neighborhood for profit. And what about honoring his actual wishes? I asked. What about the man who drove a 12-year-old Toyota and darned his own socks? What about the grandfather who taught us that kindness mattered more than money? He also taught us that actions speak louder than words, Marcus replied, and his actions were building a $90 million fortune through smart investing. Maybe it's time we started listening to what he actually did instead of what he said. That night, I couldn't sleep. I found myself wandering through the house, touching the furniture Grandpa had chosen, looking at the photographs he'd displayed, trying to find some guidance in the spaces he'd inhabited. In his bedroom closet, I discovered boxes of old documents that Marcus hadn't gotten to yet. Most of it was standard paperwork, insurance policies, medical records, correspondence with his financial advisors. But at the bottom of one box, I found something that stopped me cold. A thick folder labeled Family Trust Documentation, Draft. Inside were legal documents dated just 6 months ago, covered in Grandpa's careful handwriting. Notes in the margins, crossed-out sections, additions written in his distinctive blue ink. It was a detailed plan for establishing a family foundation, complete with mission statements, funding priorities, and governance structures. The proposed Theodore Morrison Foundation would focus on education scholarships for underprivileged children, support for veteran services, and community development projects in rural Vermont. Grandpa had outlined specific amounts: $20 million for the initial endowment, with additional funding to come from investment returns. He'd even identified potential board members and drafted applications for nonprofit status. But most importantly, he'd written a personal letter explaining his intentions. The letter was addressed to both Marcus and me, meant to be discovered after his death. My hands trembled as I read his familiar handwriting. My dear grandchildren, if you're reading this, then you've learned about the money, and you're probably wondering what to do with it. I hope by now you understand that wealth is not about what you accumulate, but about what you contribute.
I've been blessed beyond measure, not because of the numbers in my bank account, but because I had the privilege of raising two extraordinary young people who have always known the difference between having money and being defined by it. The foundation outlined in these documents represents my true wishes for this inheritance. I want you both to be financially secure, of course, hence the equal division of assets, but I also want you to remember that with great privilege comes great responsibility, not to maximize returns or optimize portfolios, but to make the world a little better than you found it.
I've watched too many families destroyed by sudden wealth, seen too many good people lose their way when money becomes more important than values. I pray that won't happen to you. I pray that you'll use this gift to honor the principles I tried to teach you: generosity, humility, service to others. The choice is yours, as it should be, but please remember that the greatest inheritance I can leave you isn't money. It's the knowledge that you have the power to choose who you become. Choose wisely. Choose with love. I sat on the bedroom floor, clutching the letter, feeling like Grandpa was speaking directly to me from beyond the grave. He'd known. Somehow, he'd anticipated exactly what was happening: the temptation, the conflict, the risk of letting wealth corrupt what mattered most. And he'd tried to leave us a roadmap back to ourselves. The foundation documents were incredibly detailed, showing months of careful planning. Grandpa had consulted with nonprofit lawyers, researched similar organizations, even identified specific schools and veterans groups that would benefit from the foundation's work. This wasn't a vague charitable impulse, it was a comprehensive plan for transforming inherited wealth into lasting social impact. But he'd never filed the paperwork, never made it official. Perhaps he'd run out of time, or perhaps he'd wanted us to make the choice ourselves. Either way, the decision now fell to Marcus and me. I looked at the clock, 2:47 a.m. Downstairs, I could see light spilling from under the dining room door. Marcus was still awake, probably reviewing more investment projections or researching development opportunities. Tomorrow, I would show him what I'd found. I would share Grandpa's actual vision for our inheritance. And then we would find out who we really were when faced with the choice between easy money and hard responsibility. Outside, an owl called from the maple tree in the backyard, the same tree where Grandpa used to point out different birds during our childhood breakfasts. He'd taught us their names, their habits, their role in the ecosystem. Everything connected, everything serving a purpose beyond itself. Perhaps that's what he'd been trying to teach us all along. Sunday morning arrived gray and overcast, matching the tension that had settled over the house like fog. I'd barely slept after discovering Grandpa's foundation documents, spending most of the night rehearsing how to present them to Marcus. At 7 a.m., I found him already dressed and checking his phone in the kitchen, a fresh pot of coffee brewing. "We need to talk," I said, setting the folder of documents on the counter between us. Marcus glanced at the papers without interest. "If this is about the development consultation, I already told you. It's about what Grandpa actually wanted us to do with the money." That got his attention. He set down his phone and looked at the folder more carefully, recognizing Grandpa's handwriting on the tab. "Where did you find this?" "His bedroom closet. He spent months planning this, Marcus. A foundation, a real charitable organization with specific goals and funding structures." I opened the folder and pulled out the mission statement. The Theodore Morrison Foundation, focused on education, veteran services, and community development. Marcus picked up the documents and started reading, his expression shifting from curiosity to something harder to read. He was quiet for several minutes, flipping through page after page of Grandpa's careful planning. "This is dated 6 months ago," he said finally. Right around when his health started declining, he knew he didn't have much time left. Marcus continued reading, pausing at the financial projections. He wanted to put $20 million into an endowment. $20 million, Chelsea. That's nearly a quarter of the estate. He wanted to put it to work helping people. Isn't that better than letting it sit in some hedge fund making rich people richer? But Marcus was shaking his head, the same dismissive expression he'd worn when I'd questioned the investment advisors. "This is incredibly naive financial planning. $20 million in an endowment generating maybe 4% annually?
That's $800,000 a year in scholarships and grants. We could make 10 times that impact by investing aggressively and donating the profits. Or we could lose it all in a market crash. Or we could build something sustainable, something that grows over time instead of shrinking. Marcus set the papers down and looked at me with the same patience he might show a confused child. Chelsea, I appreciate the sentiment here, but Grandpa wasn't a professional philanthropy expert. This foundation structure is inefficient, the overhead costs are excessive, and the investment strategy is far too conservative. I felt something snap inside me. Inefficient? Marcus, he researched this for months. He consulted with nonprofit lawyers, identified specific organizations to partner with, even outlined governance structures to prevent exactly the kind of mission drift you're describing.
He consulted with small-town Vermont lawyers who probably handle 3 charitable cases a year, Marcus replied. The people I've been talking to manage billions in philanthropic assets. They understand how to maximize social impact through strategic giving. The people you've been talking to understand how to maximize their own management fees. Marcus's jaw tightened. That's unfair, and you know it. Is it? Jennifer Brooks gets paid a percentage of assets under management. Patricia Walsh bills by the hour for trust administration. David Chen takes a cut of every tax strategy he implements. Every single person you've hired has a financial incentive to make our money as complicated and expensive as possible. They have expertise we don't have. And Grandpa had something they don't have, actual values. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the backyard. When he turned back to face me, his expression was colder than I'd ever seen it. You want to talk about values, Chelsea? Let's talk about values. Grandpa valued education. He was a teacher for 37 years. But this foundation would fund maybe 15 college scholarships a year. 15! Do you know how many students we could help if we invested that $20 million properly and donated $5 million annually instead of $800,000? And if the market crashes, if we lose half our capital in the next recession, then we rebuild. That's what investors do. That's what Grandpa did after every market downturn for 40 years. I picked up the letter Grandpa had written, the one that had moved me to tears just hours before. Listen to this, I said, beginning to read aloud. I hope by now you understand that wealth is not about what you accumulate, but about what you contribute. Marcus interrupted me. I don't need you to read me his letter. I can see it right there. Then why aren't you listening to it? Because I'm listening to his actions instead of his words. Marcus walked back to the counter and spread out some of the investment documents. Look at these stock purchases. Apple in 1982, Microsoft in 1986, Amazon in 1997. He took enormous risks with his money, Chelsea. He bought into companies that most financial advisors said were overvalued. He ignored conventional wisdom and bet on disruptive technology. So he understood that playing it safe isn't always the most responsible choice. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks to achieve extraordinary results. Marcus pointed to the foundation documents. This endowment strategy, this is the financial equivalent of stuffing money under a mattress. It's the opposite of everything he actually did with his investments. I stared at my brother, realizing that we were looking at the same evidence and reaching completely opposite conclusions. Marcus saw Grandpa's aggressive investment strategy as proof that he would have wanted us to maximize returns. I saw his charitable intentions as proof that he'd always planned to give the money away. What about the part where he talks about families being destroyed by sudden wealth? What about his warning that money can corrupt people's values? What about it? We're not being corrupted. We're being responsible. There's a difference between letting money change who you are and letting it help you become who you're supposed to be. And who are we supposed to be, Marcus? Investment managers? Property developers? People who see everything in terms of profit margins and market opportunities? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents scattered across the counter. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer but no less determined. We're supposed to be people who don't waste the gifts we've been given. Grandpa worked for 40 years to build this fortune.
He made sacrifices, took risks, lived below his means so that someday we'd have opportunities he never had. And you want to throw that away on feel-good charity work that helps a handful of people instead of thousands? I want to honor his actual wishes instead of substituting my own judgment for his. His wishes weren't legally binding. They weren't even filed with the state. This folder is just ideas, Chelsea, rough drafts and good intentions. Marcus gathered up the foundation documents and held them out to me. But these investment projections, these property assessments, these are real opportunities with measurable outcomes. I took the papers back, holding them against my chest like a shield. So what happens now? Do we vote? We flip a coin? How do we decide between completely different visions for our inheritance? Marcus checked his watch. We make decisions like adults. I have a conference call with the investment team at 10, then lunch with the development consultants at noon. By tonight, I'll have concrete proposals for moving forward. Real numbers, real timelines, real returns. And if I don't agree,
Then we'll figure out how to split the assets equitably. You can take your half and start whatever kind of foundation you want. I'll take my half and build something that actually grows. The casualness of his suggestion hit me like a physical blow. After 15 years of being raised together, after sharing the same loss and the same inheritance, Marcus was ready to simply divide everything down the middle and go our separate ways. The money had already driven a wedge between us, and we hadn't even finished reading the will. "That's what you want?" I asked. "To split up everything Grandpa worked for? To turn his legacy into a business transaction?" Marcus paused at the kitchen doorway, his hand on the frame. "What I want is to make sure that 20 years from now, we're not sitting in some lawyer's office explaining to our children how we squandered the greatest gift anyone ever gave us because we were too sentimental to make hard choices." After he left for his meetings, I sat alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of 40 years of careful planning. Grandpa's foundation documents, Marcus's investment projections, legal papers, financial statements, and the ghost of the man who'd brought us all together. Outside, the maple tree in the backyard was shedding its leaves, marking the end of another season in a cycle that had repeated itself for decades before we arrived and would continue long after we were gone. But inside this house, something fundamental was ending. The family that Theodore Morrison had fought so hard to preserve was fracturing along the fault lines of wealth, ambition, and irreconcilable differences about what it meant to honor the dead. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for James Fitzgerald, our grandfather's lawyer. It was time to get some professional advice that wasn't focused on maximizing returns. It was time to find out what legal options existed for honoring a dead man's wishes when the living couldn't agree on what those wishes actually meant. The phone rang twice before Fitzgerald's familiar voice answered. "Chelsea, how are you holding up?" "I need to ask you something about Grandpa's foundation documents," I said, "and I need to know if there's any way to make sure his real wishes are honored, even if not everyone in the family agrees." There was a pause. "Why don't you come in tomorrow morning? I think we need to have a conversation about some things your grandfather asked me to share with you, but only if certain circumstances arose." My heart started racing. What kind of circumstances? The kind where his grandchildren might lose sight of why he worked so hard to leave them something meaningful in the first place. Monday morning felt like walking into battle. I arrived at Fitzgerald's law office at 9 sharp, my stomach churning with anticipation and dread. Marcus had left the house before dawn for another meeting with his investment team, claiming he needed to finalize the portfolio restructuring timeline. We'd barely spoken since our confrontation over the foundation documents, communicating only through terse text messages about scheduling and logistics. James Fitzgerald greeted me with the same warm smile he'd worn at our first meeting, but I could see concern in his eyes. His secretary brought coffee and closed the door behind her, leaving us alone in the wood-paneled office that smelled of old books and leather. "Before we begin," Fitzgerald said, settling behind his desk, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. How would you describe your relationship with Marcus right now?" The question caught me off guard. Why do you need to know that?
Because your grandfather gave me very specific instructions about certain information I was to share only if his grandchildren began to diverge in their approaches to his legacy. I felt a chill run down my spine. He anticipated this? He knew we might fight over the money? Fitzgerald opened the different file folder, this one sealed with red wax. Theodore Morrison was an extraordinarily perceptive man. He lived through the Depression, served in Korea, watched families torn apart by sudden wealth throughout his investment career. He understood human nature better than most people understand themselves. He broke the wax seal and pulled out several documents I'd never seen before. 3 months before he died, your grandfather came to me with concerns. He'd noticed changes in Marcus during their phone conversations. Questions about the estate, casual inquiries about property values, comments about optimizing family assets. Nothing overtly concerning, but enough to worry a man who'd spent his life studying people's behavior around money. What kind of changes? Marcus had started referring to the inheritance as our portfolio instead of Grandpa's money. He'd begun researching investment strategies without being asked. Small things, but they suggested someone who was already mentally taking ownership before the actual owner had died. I thought about Marcus's immediate transformation after the will reading, his rapid assembly of financial advisors, his calculated approach to every aspect of our inheritance. Had Grandpa somehow predicted exactly what would happen?
Fitzgerald continued reading from the sealed documents. Theodore asked me to prepare what he called a final safety net, additional instructions to be shared only if certain conditions were met. Specifically, if one of his grandchildren appeared to be prioritizing wealth accumulation over his stated values. What kind of instructions? The lawyer pulled out a thick legal document and set it in front of me. A secondary will provision, legally binding, that I was authorized to execute if I determined that his primary wishes were being disregarded. It's called a conditional codicil. My hands trembled as I picked up the document. The legal language was dense, but the core message was crystal clear. If James Fitzgerald determined that either beneficiary was acting contrary to Theodore Morrison's fundamental values, specifically if they prioritized financial gain over charitable giving, family unity, or community welfare, that beneficiary would forfeit their inheritance entirely. He could do that? Take away our inheritance after he's dead? With proper legal preparation, yes. The conditional codicil is rarely used, but it's perfectly valid. Theodore wanted to ensure that his money would go to people who shared his values, even if those people turned out not to be his biological heirs. I read further into the document, my heart pounding. The forfeited inheritance wouldn't simply disappear. It would be transferred to a list of alternate beneficiaries: local schools, veterans organizations, environmental groups, the food bank where Grandpa had volunteered, the very organizations he'd planned to support through his foundation. Where does the money go if someone is disinherited? To the Theodore Morrison Charitable Trust, which I was instructed to establish immediately upon triggering the conditional codicil. The trust would be administered by a board of directors consisting of community leaders your grandfather trusted implicitly. And if both of us are disinherited? Fitzgerald's expression grew grave. Then the entire estate goes to charity, as Theodore ultimately believed it should. He told me that if neither of his grandchildren could honor his values, then strangers might do a better job carrying forward his legacy. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Does Marcus know about this? No, and Theodore specifically instructed me not to reveal this information unless absolutely necessary. He hoped you would both make the right choices without external pressure. But you think that's not happening? Fitzgerald leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. Chelsea, I've been practicing estate law for 35 years. I've seen inheritances bring out the best and worst in people. What I'm seeing from Marcus right now, the aggressive investment strategies, the development schemes, the dismissal of his grandfather's charitable intentions, these are classic warning signs. Warning signs of what? Of someone who's lost sight of why they inherited money in the first place. I set the document down with shaking hands. What exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to make a choice. I can implement the conditional codicil today, which would disinherit Marcus and transfer his portion to the charitable trust. Or you can try to convince him to change course. Or you can do nothing and let him continue down his current path.
The weight of the decision pressed down on me like a physical force. Marcus was my brother, the person who'd helped me with homework and taught me to drive and been there for every major moment of my life. But he was also someone I barely recognize anymore, someone who'd transformed our grandfather's legacy into a business opportunity. If I trigger the codicil, what happens to him? He receives nothing. His half of the inheritance goes to charity, and he's legally prohibited from contesting the decision. That would destroy him. Maybe, or maybe it would save him from destroying himself. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Burlington street, where ordinary people were going about their ordinary lives, unaware that someone a few floors above them was deciding the fate of nearly $90 million. "There's something else," Fitzgerald said behind me. "Your grandfather left individual letters for each of you, to be delivered only if the conditional codicil was triggered. He wanted to explain his reasoning directly. You have a letter for Marcus?" "I do. Would you like to read yours?" Fitzgerald handed me an envelope with my name written in Grandpa's familiar handwriting. Inside was a single page, dated just 2 weeks before he died.
My dearest Chelsea, if you're reading this, then something has gone wrong with my primary plan. One of you has lost sight of what matters, and I've asked James to take action to protect my true legacy. I suspect it's not you reading this letter, but I pray I'm wrong about that. You've always had the strongest heart of anyone I've known. Even as a child, you cried when other people hurt, celebrated when others succeeded, shared whatever you had without being asked. Those qualities made you the teacher you became, and they'll make you the person you're meant to be, regardless of how much money you have. If you're reading this letter, it means you've been faced with an impossible choice: protecting someone you love from the consequences of their own greed, or protecting the values we've tried to live by your entire life. I wish I could be there to help you decide, but some choices can only be made by the person who has to live with them. Remember that loving someone sometimes means letting them face the natural consequences of their actions. I've learned that wealth reveals character rather than creating it. If someone chooses money over family, profit over principles, accumulation over contribution, that's who they really are, not who the money made them become. Whatever you decide, know that I'm proud of the woman you've become and the woman you'll continue to be. The greatest gift I can leave you isn't money. It's the certainty that you know the difference between having wealth and being defined by it. Choose with love, but choose with wisdom. All my love, Grandpa. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope, my vision blurred by tears I couldn't control. Outside, life continued. People walking to work, traffic moving through intersections, the ordinary rhythm of a world that had no idea how much everything had just changed. "What would you do?" I asked Fitzgerald, "if you were in my position?" The lawyer was quiet for a long moment. "I would ask myself one question. What would Theodore Morrison want me to do? Not what would make me feel better, not what would preserve family relationships, not what would avoid conflict, but what would honor the man who trusted me with this decision." I checked my phone. Marcus would be finishing his investment meeting soon, probably calling to update me on whatever aggressive new strategy his advisors had recommended. In a few hours, he'd expect me to sign papers agreeing to his plans for restructuring our inheritance, liquidating assets, and maximizing returns. How long do I have to decide? As long as you need. But Chelsea, every day you wait is another day Marcus moves further away from the person your grandfather hoped he would be. Sometimes the greatest kindness is refusing to enable someone's worst impulses. I thought about the Marcus I'd grown up with, who'd comforted me when Mom died, who'd been my protector and friend through the hardest years of our lives. Then I thought about Marcus, who'd hired development consultants to assess our grandfather's neighborhood, who'd dismissed 40 years of charitable intentions as naive financial planning, who'd been ready to split our inheritance rather than honor the man who'd raised us. The question wasn't whether I could disinherit my brother. The question was whether I could save him from disinheriting himself. I drove back to Grandpa's house in a daze, the conditional codicil documents burning like fire in my passenger seat. The weight of the decision I had to make felt heavier than the October sky, which had turned dark and threatening while I was in the lawyer's office.
Rain began pattering against my windshield as I pulled into the driveway, where Marcus's rental car was already parked. Inside, I found him in the dining room, surrounded by even more papers than before. His laptop connected to a large monitor, displaying complex financial charts. He was on the phone, speaking in the clipped, confident tone I'd grown to hate over the past week. Confirmed the portfolio rebalancing can be completed by Friday. Yes, I understand the risk parameters. We're comfortable with the aggressive growth strategy. Excellent. Have the documents couriered over this afternoon. He ended the call and looked up at me with satisfaction. Perfect timing. I've got incredible news. Jennifer's team has identified a venture capital opportunity that could potentially double our money within 18 months. Marcus, we need to talk. We can talk while you look at these projections. He turned his laptop screen toward me, showing a presentation titled Morrison Family Wealth Management Strategy, Phase 1 Implementation. This biotech startup has breakthrough technology for cancer treatments, ground floor investment opportunity, but we need to move fast. I set the conditional codicil documents on the table between us. I said we need to talk. Marcus glanced at the papers without interest. More legal paperwork. Chelsea, I appreciate your attention to detail, but we can handle the administrative stuff later. Right now, we need to focus on time-sensitive opportunities. This isn't administrative stuff. This is about whether you're going to keep your inheritance at all.
That got his attention. He closed the laptop and picked up the documents, his expression shifting from dismissive to concerned as he began reading. I watched his face change as he processed what he was seeing. Confusion, then disbelief, then something approaching panic. "What the hell is this?" he asked, his voice tight. "It's a conditional codicil. Grandpa anticipated that one of us might lose sight of his values, so he gave his lawyer the power to disinherit anyone who prioritized wealth accumulation over his charitable intentions." Marcus read through the entire document twice, his hands shaking slightly by the time he finished. "This can't be legal. You can't just take away someone's inheritance after the person is dead." "You can if you plan it properly. Fitzgerald has been managing estates for 35 years. He knows exactly what he's doing." Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back, his composure finally cracking completely. "So what? You're threatening me? You're going to have me disinherited unless I agree to waste $20 million on some half-baked foundation idea?" "I'm not threatening you, Marcus. I'm trying to save you." "Save me from what? From being successful? From making smart financial decisions? From actually honoring what Grandpa built instead of throwing it away on feel-good charity work?" I pulled out Grandpa's letter and set it on the table. "He wrote you a letter, in case this moment ever came. Do you want to read what he had to say?" Marcus stared at the envelope like it might explode. "I don't need to read anything. I know what he would want, for us to be responsible with his money, not emotional." "Then read it." "No." "Why not?" "Because I don't want to be manipulated by guilt from beyond the grave." Marcus's voice was rising, his careful control finally snapping. "He's dead, Chelsea, dead, and the living get to make decisions for the living. Even if those decisions betray everything he believed in. Everything he believed in was building this fortune in the first place. You think he spent 40 years making smart investments so we could give it all away to charity? You think he lived below his means and took calculated risks so we could fund a few college scholarships for random strangers?" I stood up to face him directly. "I think he spent 40 years proving that you can accumulate wealth without losing your humanity, and right now, you're proving the opposite." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He went completely still, his face cycling through anger, hurt, and something that might have been recognition. "You really think I've lost my humanity? I think you've forgotten who you used to be. The Marcus I grew up with would never have hired consultants to tear down our grandfather's neighborhood. The Marcus who helped me with homework and taught me to drive wouldn't dismiss our grandfather's charitable wishes as naive financial planning." Marcus sat down heavily, suddenly looking older than his 29 years. "You want to know the truth, Chelsea? I'm terrified. I'm absolutely terrified of screwing this up.
$90 million. That's more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. What if I make the wrong choices? What if I'm not smart enough or careful enough and I lose it all? It was the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him since the funeral. So you hired experts to make the choices for you? I hired people who know more than I do about managing serious wealth. People who've done this before, who understand the complexities and risks I can't even imagine. But Marcus, those people don't know Grandpa. They don't know us. They don't know anything about why this money matters beyond its dollar value. Marcus picked up the letter addressed to him, turning it over in his hands without opening it. What if I read this and it changes everything? What if I can't go back to seeing this as just a financial opportunity? Would that be so bad? Yes, because then I'd have to live with the fact that I've spent the last week becoming exactly the kind of person Grandpa was trying to warn us about. I sat down across from him, leaning forward over the table covered in investment projections and legal documents. Marcus, do you remember what you told me at the funeral, when I was crying at the graveside? I told you that real men don't cry. You told me that Grandpa would want us to be strong. You said he'd want us to honor his memory with dignity.
Marcus nodded slowly. What if honoring his memory means accepting that some things are more important than maximizing returns? What if being strong means having the courage to give money away instead of accumulating more? For a long moment, the only sound in the room was rain against the windows. Marcus stared at the letter, then at the conditional codicil, then at me. If I change course now, he said quietly, I'll have to fire all the advisors I hired, cancel all the investment strategies, admit that I was wrong about everything, and start the foundation he actually wanted us to create. The foundation that will help maybe a dozen kids go to college instead of building generational wealth for our own families. The foundation that will carry his name and his values forward long after we're gone. Marcus opened the letter and began reading. I watched his expression change with each paragraph, saw his shoulders sag as the full weight of what he'd become settled over him. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and set it down beside the conditional codicil. He knew, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. He knew exactly what would happen to me. What did he say? That money doesn't create character, it reveals it. That I had a choice between becoming the kind of man who builds things or the kind who just counts things. Marcus looked up at me, and for the first time in a week, I saw my real brother again. He said he hoped I was strong enough to choose a building. Are you? Marcus was quiet for several minutes, staring out at the rain. Finally, he reached for his phone and started dialing. Jennifer, it's Marcus Morrison. I need to cancel all our investment strategies, effective immediately. Yes, I understand there will be fees. No, we won't be needing your services after all. He made 6 more calls over the next hour, politely but firmly dismissing every consultant and advisor he'd hired. Each conversation was difficult, involving cancellation fees and disappointed professionals who'd been counting on managing our millions. But with each call, Marcus looked more like himself and less like the calculating stranger who'd taken over his body. When he finished the last call, he picked up Grandpa's foundation documents and started reading through them carefully, making notes in the margins with a pen from his grandfather's desk. The scholarship program is actually brilliant, he said, looking up at me. He identified schools in rural Vermont where kids have potential but no resources. The Veteran Services component addresses gaps in government programs, and the Community Development Fund could make a real difference in places like this neighborhood. So, you want to do it? Actually establish the foundation? Marcus nodded. I want to do it right, the way he would have done it, not some watered-down version that makes us feel good while protecting our wealth. Over the next 3 hours, we worked together to understand Grandpa's vision and plan its implementation. Marcus used his financial expertise to structure the foundation properly, while I contributed the educational background to design effective scholarship programs. It felt like we were finally honoring not just Grandpa's money, but his wisdom.
As evening fell, we sat in his living room where he'd taught us to play chess, where he'd helped us with homework, where he'd listened to our teenage problems with infinite patience. The house felt peaceful for the first time since his death, like his presence had returned now that we'd found our way back to his values. "I need to apologize," Marcus said suddenly, "for everything I said about real men not crying, for dismissing your grief, for turning his death into a business opportunity." "You were scared," I replied. "We both were. Inheriting this much money, it's terrifying when you really think about it. But you didn't lose yourself. You never forgot who he was or what he meant to us. I came close. If I'd found those documents a day later, or if Fitzgerald hadn't intervened," I shrugged. "Money changes people, Marcus, even good people." 6 months later, the Theodore Morrison Foundation was officially established with an initial endowment of $30 million, more than Grandpa had originally planned, funded by both our shares of the inheritance. Marcus had discovered that giving money away strategically was actually more challenging and rewarding than simply accumulating it. We kept the house on Maple Ridge Drive, turning it into the Foundation's headquarters, while preserving Grandpa's study exactly as he'd left it. Mrs. Henderson still brings coffee on Tuesday and Friday mornings, now for Foundation staff instead of Theodore Morrison, but the tradition continues. The first scholarship recipients were announced on what would have been Grandpa's 84th birthday, 15 students from rural Vermont schools, kids who reminded me of Marcus and me at their age, smart, ambitious, but without the resources to fulfill their potential. Standing in the high school auditorium, watching their faces when they learned their college dreams were now possible, I finally understood what Grandpa had been trying to teach us all along. Wealth isn't what you accumulate, it's what you contribute. And the greatest inheritance isn't money, it's the wisdom to know the difference between having enough and having meaning. Marcus still wears expensive suits and drives a nice car, but now he spends his days reviewing scholarship applications and visiting rural schools instead of maximizing investment returns. He's become the kind of man who builds things that matter rather than just counting money that doesn't. And sometimes, late in the evening when the Foundation office is quiet, I swear I can feel Grandpa's presence in the room, proud of what we built, grateful that his grandchildren finally learned that real strength isn't measured by the tears you don't cry, but by the lives you change with the love you give away. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.